All right, 2018-2019 World History and AP World. Just a very quick review of what we've been going over so far. And here we have cave paintings that are spread across the world, from France to Spain to North Africa, showing that people around the world are going to roughly do the same thing at the exact same time. And especially between Africa, Asia, and Europe, there has always been some cultural diffusion, which is the spreading of ideas, religion, culture, technology through trade, warfare, or migration. Now over here at Newspaper Rock in Utah, where this handsome gentleman is, looks a lot like me, is also some different drawings. Kind of some of the same things. Hunters, animals, large herds of game. So even in the Americas, people are still making cave paintings that are roughly similar. This is over in Canyonlands National Park, just up the road from where Newspaper Rock was. This is Monument Valley, Utah, where we see large deer or antelope, very similar to one of the pictographs we saw in the first slide. So people all over the world are roughly doing the same thing. And the earliest part of human history is known as the Old Stone Age or the Paleolithic era, prehistory, where guys like the Iceman here in Innsbruck are starting to figure out different levels of technology. And this period of history will take us a long period of time from 52,000 BC down here to about 10,000 BC, the longest period of human history, known as prehistory, because we as humans did not write yet at this time. The people were also nomadic. They lived in bands of 20 or 30 people who had to move constantly each and every day, following herds of game. They capped out their tribes at about 20 to 30. Any more than that, it would be too hard to feed them, and it would be too hard to move to keep up with the herds of game. There was gender inequality at this time, as both men and women had to work to survive. The men hunted and fished, like I told you about Bicycle Bird when I was in Zimbabwe, and the women and children gathered the fruits, nuts, and the berries. And so human history will start out here on the east coast of Africa, spread north and southward up the east coast to North Africa, into Europe, over into Asia, down into Southeast Asia and Australia, and eventually over to North and South America via the Bering Strait. How do we remember that? People took their bearings and they went straight. And so eventually, sometime between 11 and 9,000 BC, it began to get very cold. And the Ice Age began to set in, covering part of the globe in ice. But it made this land bridge between Asia and North America, and it allowed people to migrate over here, thereby populating all continents of the earth. During the Paleolithic Age, people began to invent simple weapons and tools, bits of technology, like a digging stick or a spear, or putting a stone on it. Think of Tom Hanks in Castaway making that hatchet when he's trying to open the coconut. And while catching 30 bicycle birds is great, it'd be awesome to have one big meal where we didn't have to move constantly every single day. So here, people began to communicate, think of like raptors in Jurassic Park, to coordinate and help during the hunt. Like I'll show you pictures of a buffalo jump in Montana where the Blackfeet Sioux would chase buffaloes off a cliff so they could have meat for the winter. Language is developed. Shortly after that, people are going to discover fire for light, for protection from wild animals, for safety, and for cooking their food. And then it gets really, really, really cold, and a lot of weaker or less smart people die off, and the Ice Age sets in. And when the Ice Age recedes, a giant quantum leap in human evolution happens. This is the Neolithic Revolution, or the New Stone Age, where people begin to farm. They produce their own foods. It is a giant leap in human history. And they have extra time, since they can now remain in one place, to develop new skills and new tools. Labor-saving devices, as they sat down in their thinking chairs and they were think. They were making technology. Whether it was by accident or design, sheer luck, people began to plant crops. They began to domesticate animals, dogs, sheep, goats, cows. They began to build permanent dwellings, and so for the first time people had a surplus of food, or more food than people could eat, so they had extra. This leads to a massive population boom. We have more people interacting, so villages began to form. And people had to understand geography, how to mold and adapt the land around them in order to survive. Here's that picture of one of the old dwellings at Sakra Bra in the Orkney Islands off Scotland, kind of like hobbit houses. In the Neolithic Age, unfortunately, changes begin to take place as gender inequality begins to happen, as men begin to slowly dominate the political, the economic, and the social life of the families. And guys become more prominent as women are tied to domestic duties. But all of this is going to require the creation of the world's first governments. At first, these governments were led by a council of elders, old people with experience who knew when it was to plant and knew when it was to harvest, since they had done it a billion times. Eventually, priests began to take charge. The people of this day and age were polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many different gods and goddesses. Normally, they were associated with the forces of nature: god of the wind, god of the rain, goddess of the earth to make the plants grow. And the priest said that they couldn't spend the time laboring with everybody else. They needed to go up to the temple to pray to make sure the village will survive. Since they had religious backing, they become the governmental leaders, forming a theocracy. Shortly after that, some villages were successful and some were not. So some people begin to go out and conquer. So priests are great, but what will keep you safe is a strong warrior male. So leadership goes from a council of elders to a high priest to a strong warrior male who can defend our city. And this is important because at this time we began to collect things in our villages, personal property, making some of us appear wealthier than our neighbors, which leads to job specialization. People find out they're really good at one thing. Some are stonemasons. Some become like blacksmiths or butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. And your skill makes you necessary. People want what you have. So you kind of raise your place in society because of your skill, your artisan craft. Modern day artisans, mechanics, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, HVAC people, big money jobs that people overlook until you need them. These artisans didn't have to go and labor in the fields every day like some of their friends. Right? They could choose when they were going to work. As long as they got their work done, nobody cared. and it gave them a little bit of freedom. And so societies begin to build complex art and architecture. Big monuments, temples, pyramids, governmental buildings that represent the feelings, the thoughts, and the beliefs, the values and the beliefs of their civilization. The Egyptian pyramids, Mesopotamian ziggurats, cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in India, the Roman Colosseum, the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, you name it. And they had to be smart to expand the city as the population got too big, and trade networks are going to open. Massive cultural diffusion. We talked about the religion, always complex and polytheistic. And these early rulers tried to control everything by themselves, to be hands-on, but eventually the cities got too big, so they would need complex. So they formed bureaucracies or different departments to make sure the work was getting done. You're in charge of air irrigation. You're in charge of training the army and building the defensive walls. You're in charge of tax collection. They helped leaders govern a city and an empire. And around 3200 BC in Mesopotamia, people began to write, to record information. First information was probably done by priests, recording their prayers and their rituals. Eventually, merchants and the government begins to use it, and poor people would offer their young sons up to be scribes, because if they wrote well enough and they learned well enough, then the family got to move up into the temple or the palace as well. So early on, learning to write and getting an education was an extensive skill or important skill. And this leads us to the creation of the city-state, which is a city and its surrounding farmland that operates as an independent country. Their own laws, their own ruler, their own religion, their own currency. So you could be right next to somebody like Chapel Hill and Carrboro and do things completely different. And the first four areas that put together all 8 factors of civilization. They have cities. They have well-organized bureaucracies. They have a complex government. They have job specialization. They have social classes. They have their religion. They have the ability to write. Happen to be 4 areas that grow near simultaneously. Mesopotamia on the Tigris and Euphrates is the first, followed by Egypt, then the Indus River Valley civilization in ancient India, modern-day Pakistan, and the Yellow River in China. These are the first 4 areas in the world that became civilized. Now we are beginning to talk about Egypt and the Nile River right here, which I'll recap for you guys next week. But to talk about how people used technology, out in Montana next to Great Falls is the buffalo jump of Pishkin. And here it's where buffalo were very important to the kind of Paleo / Neolithic Blackfeet Sioux. And the buffalo was their lifeline. Buffaloes gave them everything. So a buffalo tendon becomes the string for a bow and arrow. The leather from the hides becomes rope and a strap. Up here, the bladder is a canteen. One of the ribs is a knife. They used some of the other ribs to bracket up their teepees, their dwellings they could take down and put up very quickly. They dried and smoked the meat, so they had it with them during the cold winter months on the high plains. So what they would do, where you see my family here, this all looks like a giant flat plain. But up here, there's a big drop-off. So the Sioux would kind of hide out in here in a little hut. And this is where the young 12 or 13-year-old boys and girls would hang out, trying to be an adult in the tribe. They would get up the next morning and they would start messing with the young calves dressed in buffalo skin. Then the older braves would jump up and start baying, "Ow!" like wolves, and the buffalo herds would take off. The young boys and girls would get up and run toward this cliff edge, which again looks flat. Over here, however, you can see just the thousands of hoof marks by the stampedes of the buffalo. They would come flying off of this cliff. Eventually, the buffalo would turn, but now the people have 10, 12, 15 buffalo that they can quickly skin. They can use their hide. They can use the meat to wait out the long winter. Then wolves would come in, literally, and wolves have a function where their brain doesn't tell them when they would stop eating. The wolves would literally eat themselves to death, and then the Blackfeet would use the wolf hide to make waterproof mittens and boots. So that is how Paleolithic people existed. This is review number 1. Hope you guys watched it. Be sure to subscribe. That way finding these reviews is much easier. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.